On behalf of the Baker Institute, our Center for Energy Studies, our Mexico Center, I welcome you to this event that we are proudly organizing with our friends in the University of Texas at Austin, in particular the K. Bailey Hutchinson Center for Energy Law and Business, the Center for Energy Economics of the Bureau of Economic Geology at the School of Geosciences of the University of UT Austin, and the Latin American Studies program at UT Austin. So this is an event, a statewide event.
That we can actually tell people we succeeded in doing a statewide event.
Exactly. So we have 5 co-organizing organizations, and we have a terrific program, I think, for you. With 2 panels, one sort of introductory panel to give you an overview of what's happening in Mexico, and particularly regarding this very important topic of how the energy reform will deal with issues related to social impact. As you know, not only in Mexico, but everywhere, the concerns to the relationship with the local communities and sort of the license to operate in certain areas, and all the implications that have on the ground are really important in energy. I mean, in the U.S., that is relevant, for example, for pipelines. In Mexico, it will be relevant for every single type of project, from oil and gas to electricity, renewables. All of them face the challenges of implementing these in a country that for a long time had monopolies both in oil, gas, and electricity. And so this is a totally different a scenario and a totally different era. We did an event a few months back on the other sort of hot topic, which is, of course, the Mexican election and what that can mean for the energy reform. We might touch on those subjects, but today's focus will be more on the implementation of the reform, of the of the involvement of the new projects and the private sector in the different areas of energy reform in both oil and electricity. The director of the Center on Energy Studies, Ken Medlock, couldn't be here. He was going to introduce our meeting today, but he will be arriving later. So I am also the moderator of our first panel. And by the way, I'm also want to welcome. We have with us today a few of our new and already existing non-resident fellows and scholars. Lourdes Melgar, who was the director of hydrocarbons of the vice minister of hydrocarbons in the Peña Nieto administration, that basically designed and implemented the reform. She is starting as a non-resident fellow for the Center on Energy Studies here. Similarly, Benigna Leis, that was the country head of Chevron in Mexico, and that has a very distinguished career in the oil and gas sector in Latin America, is also joining us as a fellow. And of course, Miriam Grunstein, who has been from the outset of the Mexico Center one of the most prolific authors and publishing in the Mexico Center. So we are proud to have all of them here and our partners from the University of Texas. So let me, you have the bios of our speakers there, but just to mention that besides having Lourdes, who, as I said, was a key actor in the design and implementation of the hydrocarbon reform, she also previously held positions on the electricity side, so she can also speak to that. We also have Jose Maria Lujambio, who had also prominent positions in the in the Calderon administration, in the regulatory positions in the Mexican government, and currently heads the practice of the firm Cacho. Sorry for the pronunciation, that probably is French, Cavazos and Newton in Austin. And so he can also offer us a very interesting perspective from both his time as a regulator and now in private practice and advising companies, private companies, on dealing with these issues. And of course we have Tony Payan, the director of our Mexico Center, who can give us an overview of what's happening on the ground in terms of social conflict, violence, and the political situation in Mexico. Then after this panel, we will have sort of the big star of this event, which is Miriam Grunstein, who will be presenting her work that she's doing for the University of Texas at Austin as a fellow on the Latin America program on case studies related to this issue. And then we will have a very interesting panel of discussants with Professor Owen Anderson from the University of Texas at Austin, Benigna Leis, we already introduced, and of course Michelle Foss, which has been the leading force in organizing this event, who leads the Center for Energy Economics at UT, but here based in Houston. So our three panelists will have 8 to 10 minutes to give introductory remarks. I think we will go first Tony, then Lourdes, and then Jose Maria. And then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then I will open up for your questions. Thank you very much. So go ahead, Tony.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Francisco, and thank you, Michelle. Thank you, all the organizers of this event, and thanks for including me to talk about Mexico. Mexico is kind of a privileged country here at the Baker Institute because it is the only country that has its own center. There's a Center for the Middle East, and then there's a Latin American Initiative, and so on, but Mexico has its own center. And so that's, I think, quite interesting to be directing that. But it also bespeaks to the fact that Mexico is important, and it's important to the United States, it's important to the future of North America. It's one of the only other two neighbors, and the fact that the relationship has been working well, relatively well, diplomatically and politically, for the last 30 years. But it's been upended to a large extent in the last 2.5 years, because we have in the United States now a president that is reconsidering that partnership with Mexico. And then in response, I think Mexicans have become more, I guess they've given themselves greater permission to reconsider the relationship with the United States on several scores. One of which is, if the United States is going to be considerably more nationalistic in its interests and less internationalist, and conceive of its leadership as more self-centered rather than global leadership and the leadership for the international community, then Mexicans gave themselves permission to reconceive their own politics. And now we have on the ground in Mexico a candidate who is also quite nationalistic. Some of us have been watching the Mexican election for the last couple of years. What's the PAN going to do? What's the PRI going to do? And what's the left going to do? And we now know, and we're about 3.5 weeks away from an election. I think it's comforting that Mr. López Obrador has become more pragmatic in this election. I don't think he's the radical Rambo that he appeared to be 12 years ago. I think he met with the private sector, try to reassure them, and they, of course, sort of express their concerns and so on. The media itself in Mexico is beginning to treat him differently, more deferently, thinking that he might be the next president. And so they're going to have to build a relationship with the new administration. So everybody's sort of jockeying for a new position on the Mexican political chessboard. And I think that's fine. But my guess is that Mexico, even though the public in Mexico is thinking seriously about what is coming up, I think most Mexicans still value the relationship with the United States. They still value a good partnership with Americans. And in fact, some of the polls show that most Mexicans still admire and appreciate the United States. They don't like the Trump administration, but I don't think that they see the United States as fundamentally an enemy of Mexico. And so I think that's going to settle well in Mexico. So my prediction is that if any changes happen in the binational relationship, most of them are going to come from Washington, not from Mexico City. Yes, Mr. López Obrador, if he wins the election, is going to be considerably more nationalistic. He's going to pull in that direction. That's been his platform for a while. But I don't think he intends to radically review the binational relationship. He's never really been an anti-American political figure in Mexico. In fact, his nationalism is more inward-looking. It's more about the conditions of the poor. It's more about what the injustices and the mafia in power, as he calls it, the elites. In that sense, he does have these populist undertones. So there's definitely going to be some political change in Mexico, but I don't see him as radically anti-American, radically anti-foreign company, radically anti-foreign investment. I think he's gonna be willing to work with them, and I think some of the last signs that we've seen from his team, it's still very confusing. There's still a lot of political uncertainty. There's still a lot of mixed messages that are coming from his campaign, but I think in that sense, they're still trying to figure out if they win, and it looks like they're going to, exactly what their position is going to be. So politically, all I can add is that if any serious changes, i.e. The abrogation of NAFTA, come in the future, it will be from Washington, D.C. It's not likely to come from Mexico City. So it's going to be up to us to take responsibility for what's going to happen in the binational relationship in the future. Very briefly, that's what I see politically. Now, in terms of social conflict, Pam Cruz, who is a research analyst at the Mexico Center, and I have been thinking very seriously over the last few years, couple of years, about social conflict and crime in Mexico, the organized crime and so on. And we know that organized crime has had a deep impact on the perceptions of Mexico, and it has definitely been a factor in all the different business models by different companies that want to go into Mexico. They all think about organized crime, they think about theft, they think about issues like that. I don't think that organized crime necessarily has a deeper impact on GDP, for example, than corruption by government officials. In some ways, corruption by government officials is akin to organized crime. It's just a different type of organized crime. But in both have a deep impact on this. So we have to think about both of them. And I want to put it on the table because I think we often tend to say, no, one thing is social conflict. One thing is the indigenous groups, the environmental groups, the ranchers and farmers, landowners who may or may not give the right of way, who may fight it in the courts or not. Might fight the law, the implementation of the law or not. Those things are there, and they're going to be important, and we have to take a look at them. But I think organized crime is a kind of social conflict. Deep down, I think it has to be put in the mix, even though the title of the conference doesn't include the word organized crime. Organized crime is, in the end, a type of social conflict. It's a type of resistance and weakness of the state and a back and forth between different groups who see a black market advantage there. And so I just want to mention a couple of things that we put a map there. This map is not ours, okay? We made it here at the Baker Institute, but based on data from a consulting firm, and it is the basis of our work. We have two huge databases. One of them done by Guillermo Valdez, who was the director of CISEN in Mexico, and it's between 94 and 2006, and it has 25,000 different events of social unrest, attacks, criminal acts, resistances, indigenous movements, and so on. This one is a lot smaller, and it's more recent, and it's not comprehensive. So one of the things that we're doing at the Mexico Center is saying, look, let's just go back and build this larger database and then divide it into two groups. The social conflicts, which in my view includes environmental and other natural resources conflicts. You see, for example, in Mexicali, Baja California, that the local people are resisting the opening of a beer plant that would come roll over from California into Mexicali because there's no water. And so people in California, in Baja California, and Mexicali specifically, are saying, hey, do you want to have a beer company that's going to suck up all the water, or is the water for the population? There is a human right to water. And so this creates different kinds of conflicts. So there's going to be conflicts over specific resources because energy production requires resources, other types of resources. Land is a resource, water is a resource, and so on. So it's going to be a conflict among different groups to prioritize the use of those resources. And that, I think, is going to be an important thing to be looking at in Mexico. The other one is indigenous communities. You have to remember, in Mexico, there are 68 different linguistic groups. And within these groups, there are different communities. And all these different groups have an ancestral claim to the land. And we have seen, for example, in Oaxaca, in some of the conflicts in Oaxaca, that some eolic or some wind parks have gone up, and a promise was made to these communities, and these promises are not always fulfilled. Royalties, payments, and a presumed benefit to the community. And so what they do often is, well, we're not making any they're not fulfilling these promises. We're not making the money. This is not of no benefit to us. We gave them the right of way. And so what people begin to do is to sabotage the windmills, and they begin to disable them, to sort of try to, dismantle them and so on. And so the companies begin to engage in conflicts. And these things are already happening, for example, in Oaxaca. And the other one, I think, has to do with land ownership. There's going to be in Mexico, a couple of things are important to watch. Number one is 51% or so of the land, it's still communally owned, either by these indigenous groups who have a claim to a certain municipality jointly. There's no title for a particular individual. It's just the community itself, and they use the land communally. 51% of that, of Mexico, is essentially communal land. And then there's also private lands, the ranchers, the farmers, and so on. And so all these different things will have to be analyzed very locally, and they're going to have to be negotiated very locally. But I think those are the three fundamental issues that we're going to see. Again, environmental and other natural resource conflicts, indigenous groups, and land ownership and right-of-way. I think those are going to be fundamental to examine depending on the projects. And of course, organized crime, which is a fourth category. I keep it separate, but I include it in the discussion because I think it is a kind of social conflict. According to these numbers, for example, 110 projects are at risk in Mexico today due to social conflicts. 110 could be a road, could be a new park, could be an airport, could be the right-of-way for a new project, and so on. But there are currently ongoing conflicts. 54 of them, half of these 110 are energy-related conflicts. So that means that as energy companies begin to push through and begin to deploy their investments, the communities begin to resist. Everybody has to benefit, and when communities do not see a benefit, at least not a direct benefit, they may then resist the project. 31 of these 54 are projects that emerged since the energy reform was passed. There are not very many. You say, well, 31 is not a whole lot. Yeah, but they're a good sign because we're only talking about three years or so, 3 to 4 years of the energy reform, and you already have 31 conflicts there. So clearly the conflicts are beginning to emerge, and I suspect that there'll be more of them. Most of the conflicts in Mexico are in these areas, mining, and that's a very serious issue. If you look at the Sonora corridor on the map, for example, the mining companies, and here's where Mexicans are beginning to look at the Canadians very closely, because Canadians are major mining investors in Mexico, but the Canadians they don't behave in a way that is environment friendly. They may protect the Canadian environment, but they don't really care about the Mexican environment. And Mexicans are beginning to, that's the image the Canadians are building for themselves, that they come in and they take the gold and the silver and so on, but they contaminate the area around, they use the roads, and they cream them into pulp, and they contaminate the water, they release some of these chemicals into the rivers, for example, what they did in Sonora and so on. And so the communities are beginning to say, okay, mining is a big issue in Mexico. And that's something that we're beginning to look at. We should expect energy development to follow that, because it is now the second most conflicts behind energy. Of course, agriculture and water are third and fourth. So we have to be watching these particular areas there. One more quick thing about the EVAS, which is the evaluation of social impacts. There's a couple of things that are important to think about when it comes to that. Number one is who are the beneficiaries of EVAS? That stands for Evaluación de Impactos Sociales, right? EVAS, social impact evaluations. Who benefits? Who are these for? Are these for the companies to understand their investment environment and to ensure that the investment is going to serve their purposes, or are they also for the community to understand the potential positive but also the negative effects? And I think that debate has not happened yet in Mexico. That is not well normed just yet. It's not well regulated just yet. And so who are these EVAS reports supposed to serve? And I've seen some of the reports in which some people make statements like, okay, the EVAS is just so the companies know and understand when their investment is at risk. Yeah, but there should also be for the community to understand what the investment means for them, bad and good. And I think that's an open debate in Mexico. The second one is, let me see, conflicts over water. I don't want to take too much of time. What are the states? You can see the other point that I wanted to make. You can see in the map that conflicts are beginning to emerge throughout the country. So it's not like you're going to say, oh, some areas of the country are conflict-free. They're not. In fact, Tamaulipas, which appears relatively conflict-free in many, many different maps that I've seen, it's just coming up because shale is likely to come onto Tamaulipas. And so you don't see any conflicts yet because the investment is not there yet. But it is very likely that as energy projects develop throughout the country, the number of conflicts will emerge, and this will be throughout the country. So it's important because you see them from Oaxaca to Chihuahua to Jalisco to Guerrero to Chiapas to Veracruz to Puebla to Mexico State. And so clearly there are conflicts all over the country. It's not like in one region of the country specifically you're going to be safe. So I think I'll stop there, except for one more remark, so I don't take more than 10 minutes here. Organized crime is an important one, but I think it's only one of the elements that we have to consider. Mexico is a very complicated country. The institutions are not very strong. They're being built, but they're not yet very strong. And I think there has been a lack of strong and clear coordination between the federal government and the local authorities and the indigenous communities. I think as of right now, and Miriam may confirm this, there isn't yet an indigenous consultation law in which these 68 different indigenous groups in Mexico, the way in which they give input and feedback to the companies and they participate in the EVASs, can you say that? The evaluation, the impact, social impact evaluation reports, I guess, the EVAS. In which they can truly be consulted, truly participate, and truly understand, even in their own language, what's going to happen to their communities and to their land. That's not there yet. So there's a lot of work institutionally to be done, a lot of different channels to be developed in Mexico that need to be worked on. If not, then we're in for a lot of just wasted time, wasted energy, wasted capital, and wasted opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Lourdes, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here this morning, and I want to thank the Baker Institute not only for the invitation, but also for the appointment as a non-resident fellow. And especially I want to thank Francisco Monaldi. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about a subject that is extremely important to me. And I apologize for beginning my remarks with a personal comment, but I I am by training a political scientist, a political economist, and I'm also a former diplomat. So negotiating is part of my DNA, and reaching agreement is something that I see as very important. And I'm bringing these to the table right now because it is quite pertinent to the subject that we're going to be touching upon. I was appointed Undersecretary of Electricity of Mexico December 12, 2012, which was just a few days after President Peña Nieto had taken office. And the very first day that I was appointed, the Secretary of Energy called me up and said, you know, we have a very serious problem, and the President has asked me to ask you to solve this issue, which was that basically on Inauguration Day, the ambassadors or representatives from several countries complained about what was happening with a major project in Mexico, a wind farm project called Mareña Renovables, which had investment from Japan, Australia, Denmark, and the pensions from the Netherlands. And I began to take a look at this issue. I talked to the company, and everybody complained that, you know, they could not develop their park, that they had done everything well, and that there was this major problem, and that, you know, they had spent all this money and nothing was happening. We started working on this project for a few days, you know, a few weeks, and eventually time began to pass by, and it was really hard to truly understand what was happening. So I told my boss one day, I said, look, Secretary, sitting here in Insurgente Sur looking cars go by, I said, I'm not going to solve this. I have to go to Oaxaca and look at this. And I said, and I don't want to go out. And so I went, put on my blue jeans, a T-shirt, and I went with my chief of staff to Oaxaca to talk to people, to listen to their experiences and try to understand what was going on. And I realized that there was a lot of complexity in this issue because it was not a very simple story of good and bad, of, the nice little businessman who's doing everything well and the nasty community. It was really a very complex problem that had to do with a lot of vested interest, a lot of history from the past, unsolved issues, etc. But also I began to see that as we tried to develop transmission lines, for instance, CFE was trying to construct transmission lines, they could not construct them because people would block the capacity of CFE to start building the transmission lines. And they were, the company, the monopolies, both Pemex and CFE, were feeling that they were hostage to communities who they had made payments to and were requesting more and more and more payments. And so we were under a culture of continuously requesting more and more money to getting things done. So as we were defining the energy reform, I thought we had to do something about this. We needed to make sure that that we found a way to make these projects viable, because otherwise no project was going to flourish. So at the constitutional level, we inscribed the concept of sustainability in our constitution, Article 25 of the Mexican Constitution. And this means sustainability in the three understood ways of sustainable development. That is economic, and we created the Mexican Petroleum Fund for that, for managing the revenue of oil revenue of the country, social and environmental. And I'm not going to touch upon the environmental, which is really interesting right now, but I'm going to center my comments on the social aspect of it, because there is an entire legal framework for dealing with conflicts. And I think one of the things that this government has been really bad at is transmitting and communicating what is really good about the reform. Everybody talks about price hike of gasoline and about, electricity rates, but nobody talks about some of the very good things that are there in the reform and that are in the process of being implemented. And it takes time. We're not going to solve problems that have been there for decades overnight. So I'm going to take a few moments to explain to you what is written into the law and how we have been able to implement it and where some of the challenges are. So first of all, I already mentioned the Constitution, but from this Article 25 of the Constitution, we derived specific chapters, both in the electricity law and in the hydrocarbons law. There are social chapters. And I'm going to go more in details with the hydrocarbons law, because in hydrocarbons we go even a step further than in electricity, just because we have the biggest challenge of developing oil and gas fields. And as you probably are well aware, in Mexico, having private companies developing fields is still a challenge. So where did we start it? Okay, the first thing was we have to recognize that, as Tony mentioned, we have indigenous communities. And not only do we have indigenous communities, but Mexico is signatory and therefore part of the 169 Convention of the International Labor Organization, which is one that says that we have to consult indigenous people on projects. Mexico signed this convention in 1990. It's been part for a long time, but they had never done an indigenous consultation. And part of the reason has to do with the fact of something that Tony mentioned, which is that we do not have a consultation law, and we don't have protocols. We didn't have anything. So in 2011, this is very important also because the Congress decided that all the international conventions that had to do with human rights had to be equated with the Constitution. So this convention became at the same legal level as the Mexican Constitution, and therefore it is mandatory for the state to really implement it. So given the fact that we had that and that we had to conduct the consultation, what we did at CENER, we tried to advance having a law or having at least a presidential decree. But we did not go very far because there was other entities in the government that were not very favorable to really moving this forward. So we developed protocols. We developed specific protocols. My team and myself developed these protocols first in the electricity sector because I was Undersecretary of Electricity at the time, and then we developed them for the hydrocarbon sector. So they're specific because it's not the same thing to consult on the construction of a combined cycle than it is on a, exploration and production of maybe shale resources. And that's what we have. And it's important and I think Mexico should move towards the development of having a specific law, because it's part of the discussion when you're conducting a consultation is, who you're consulting, what's the extent, how far you should go in terms of the people you should take into account, specific issues related to the convention that have not been specified. And I would like to mention that this is not specific to Mexico. This is happening all over the world, but specifically all over Latin America. Nobody has been able to really solve this issue yet. But not all the population in Mexico is indigenous. Mexico is very complex because we also have different property rights. And we have private property, small property, ejido land, and communal land. And depending on what type of ownership you have to consult different type of people. So one of the issues that we did is we said, okay, we have the indigenous consultation, which is it's obligation for oil and gas and electricity projects, but also let's look at the entire picture. So what we establish is an obligation for the state to conduct what is called a social study, social evaluation study. And this is an obligation because we need to have sort of a X-ray of an area, especially when we're going to put up an area for a bid for oil and gas, to to know what the conditions are. And the conditions, we're looking not only at issues such as indigenous population or the type of land, but also issues related to organized crime, to infrastructure, to what the conditions are, so that the investor knows beforehand what the conditions are. And if they don't like the conditions, then they don't have to participate in that bid. But in every single bid that we've had in Mexico, the companies, when they go into the data room, they can look at the social impact study and know what the conditions of the area are. Then we establish in law the obligation of what Tony mentioned, the EBIS, the Evaluación de Impacto Social, which actually just last week the government produced the specific regulation about detailing some of the issues related to the EBIS. So it's taken a long time to get there, but there's been a lot of discussion about how to comply with this. And we established this is some people call it social licensing. I'm not quite fond of the word of calling it social licensing, because I think it's quite limiting to think of it just in terms of like social licensing, but it's the closest that we have to a social licensing. And basically what it means is that you have to look at the positive and negative aspects of these of the project, and of course you have to communicate it to the community where you're going to be developing the project. And then you have to negotiate with the community what the benefits are going to be for the community. So I'm running out of time, but I would like to take a few minutes just to emphasize the following. In the law, it is established that the companies have to negotiate benefits for the community as a whole. And when you have an oil contract, you have to negotiate also the occupation of the land. And the first thing that we establish is you cannot sell the land for below commercial rate. So if you're going to buy the land, you have to pay commercial rate. In Mexico, we have what we call el valor catastral, which is a sort of like a very low price, or the commercial rate. It has to be at the commercial rate. The second thing is there have to be payments for all the destruction of anything that is done in this land. For instance, if you're growing corn, there has to be payment for that. If your house is going to be brought down, it has to be paid for. And also there have to be these long-term contracts for the occupation of the land, especially if you're not selling the land. And in there, of course, we were well aware of the fact that it's not the same thing for like an ExxonMobil to negotiate with maybe a campesino who doesn't have the knowledge. So we established an entire, how do you say, andamiaje institucional, like institutional framework, to support people in terms of the negotiations, which includes the fact that they can have access to lawyers that are paid by the government. They can have access to INDABIN, which puts out referrals of prices for payments for or for negotiating the prices, the payment for the house, not the houses, but for the taking away the cultivations or the animals or whatever. And there is a full support system to help out the people in these negotiations. And more importantly, it is written into the law as well that once a field goes into production, an oil field or a gas field, there is a specific payment that comes from the revenue, from the profit that the company gets. So between 0.5% to 2% for oil production and between 0.5% to 3% for gas production goes to the owner of the land or the owner of the rights to the land. And so the problem that we have in implementation is that we have different players who not necessarily know and understand this new paradigm. We're in the midst of a paradigm shift. And you have local authorities who do not know the new scheme, who completely are ignorant about the new scheme. You have the companies who are resisting the new scheme. They like much better the old one. They thought it was easier to basically pay off people and move forward. Of course, I'm not talking in general of the companies, because there are some companies who are used to this type of scheme and like it, and it's much more transparent. But some are really, want to go back to the past. And then, of course, you have also the NGOs. And I have to say this is a big issue for discussion, because within the NGOs, you have NGOs who are truly committed to working in favor of the communities, and you have others who have seen a business of being the problem solver of all these problems that often enough they also create. And so one of the things that we moved into, and I think it's really fundamental, is that Mexico is part of EITI, the Initiative for Transparency in the Extraction Industry. And this is important because you can follow the money, you can know what's happening. And this is one of the areas where there still is a lot of work to be done, because part of the idea is making sure there is transparency of who gets what, who gets paid what, and when, so that later on there are no questionings about whether or not the agreements were actually followed and accepted. So it's a long story, and I'm just making these initial remarks, but I think it's a story worth telling, worth studying, and of course it's worth getting more in depth into it, because we are only beginning the implementation. And one of the big criticisms that I have for the government is that it created a whole new system, but it didn't give the money to really implement it. And I'm not just talking of the money financially, but also the people needed to implement it. The area in charge of implementing all the consultations of indigenous population for the entire energy sector, validating all the EVs, everything is composed of 5 people. And 5 people cannot take care of all these things for an entire country. And you have many other departments or secretarias who have responsibilities and basically do not take care of their responsibilities. So that's a major challenge, because you cannot create something as nuanced, as profound as this, and then not making sure that it gets properly implemented, that everybody, not only everybody knows about it, is informed about it, but moreover takes on their responsibility. And just as a final thought, I would say what is happening in Mexico, it's not only in Mexico. I'm part of an IDB group that is looking at these issues in Latin America and everywhere. Whether you look at the energy sector or the mining sector, is the same challenges. And when we look at what happened in the US with the North Dakota pipeline, or what has been some of the debates happening in Canada, I think it's the big issue. So that means that everybody, government, companies, and even communities, we have to rethink how we create conditions so that the communities are willing to accept projects. Otherwise, there will be no more projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. You left me wanting to hear more, so I hope we can do it later. Jose Maria, please.
Thank you, Francisco. And thank you very much to the organizing institutions, and I feel very honored to share the panel with Tony, Lourdes, and Francisco. I want to go deeper into the social impact evaluation implementation process. As Lourdes was mentioning, before the energy reform in Mexico, we did not have the obligation of performing social impact evaluations for energy infrastructure projects. It was a good idea, one of the novelties of the reform, to have this obligation put both in the hydrocarbons law and in the electricity industry law. Those laws are very, succinct in the sense that they only mention that this social impact evaluation shall be conducted in order for projects to get a permit from the relevant agency, CNH, CRE, whatever, to perform their activities. So laws were passed or published in August of 2014. Then in October of 2014, President Peña Nieto issued the reglamento, which is some presidential rules that develop the rules established at the statutory level. by detailing with a couple of paragraphs what these social impact evaluations would need to contain and what would be the basic procedure for their studying and resolution by the Department of Energy, CENER. But since then, and until last week, we did not have in Mexico the specific regulations issued by the administrative agency, in this case, the Department of Energy, CENER, in order for the interested parties to know exactly what is expected from them in the elaboration of this kind of evaluations, and of course for all the stakeholders to have legal certainty. The draft of the social impact evaluation regulations was published and subject to public consultation back in March of 2015. There was a very quick report prepared by so in Mexico there's an agency in charge of regulatory improvement or regulatory enhancement that conducts this kind of public consultations. They issued a report, a favorable report, 2 weeks after the publication, and then several comments started to flow from the industry, from the different stakeholders in the next, I would say, 2 or 3 months. So there we had comments, of course, from Pemex. They sent like 6 different letters in different moments. Of course, the associations of the industry, like the Natural Gas Association, LPG associations. There are several LPG associations because we have several LPG mafias in Mexico. Of course, well, the big players such as Chevron, Sempra, Statoil, etc. And of course, well, also electricity companies as CFE, Enel, etc. Interestingly, among the stakeholders that participated in the consultation, there were only like 1 chemist, 1 biologist, 1 archaeologist, and no one else from and a group of people from the Oaxaca Isthmus, interested, of course, in wind energy development, but nothing else from the civil society or from organized groups in Mexico. One of the big differences in terms of the social organization in the US from Mexico is the vitality of the civil society and civil organizations. In the US, you organize yourselves for any purpose. In Mexico, we are more kind of dispersed, and there's not this culture of getting organized to pursue a political objective. In any case, well, the consultation was there, but then there was an impasse, a very strange impasse of really almost 3 years. Of course, most of the comments from the stakeholders were kind of negative against the draft because they said, oh, you're imposing too many costs and too many requirements in order to fulfill this obligation of having a social impact evaluation. But then what happened in the next 3 years is really a mystery for most of the industry. The draft was basically, there were no more comments until just last month in May, where a new regulatory impact assessment was published by the Secretary of Energy in the COFEMER website. COFEMER is this regulatory improvement agency. A couple of weeks later, the COFEMER issued their favorable report, and then just last Friday, the regulations were issued, and we have them there. It is good news, of course, we have them, but in the past 3 years, I guess that not having them has been a problem. because the regulations were supposed to include things such as the details about the procedure that CENER has to follow to analyze the evaluations. Of course, the formats of the information that private parties had to fill in order to prepare their evaluations. When people started preparing evaluations in the first months of the reform, they didn't know what to write in or to assess or to address there. So that was important. And also, well, these regulations were supposed and now include the methodologies to determine the different areas of influence of a project in terms of a core area, a direct influence area, and an indirect influence area. And also the identification and evaluation of social impacts, which is the core of the study. There has been, in the law and in the presidential rules, there's kind of an emphasis in the mitigation of impacts, which means that there's like an assumption that the impacts are going to be negative, or an implicit assumption. Of course, we obviously know that the social impacts of an environmental infrastructure project can be positive, negative, or neutral. And that's something that needs to be also kind of better communicated. It's not that energy projects come to destroy communities and destroy the environment sometimes, but it's not necessarily obviously the case. Energy projects obviously can have very positive impacts in terms of employment, economic development in a specific region, etc. What can I tell you? You're the experts. In any case, as Lourdes was saying, it's not really. So the procedure is only not to approve the social impact evaluation or to give a permit. It's not a social license, but the CENER only issues recommendations. Despite that, investors, when they look at projects developed by early developers, they ask for the social impact evaluation. They want to see the recommendations, and if the recommendations are, well, kind of strong or deal with issues that are complicated, they get scared. It's not that the CENER resolution is mandatory and that if you do not comply, you're going to be sanctioned. There are no sanctions, but developers want to see recommendations that are, well, not too hard to implement, right? It's been a problem also of lack of resources from the side of the CENER. Just to give you an example of a project that I've been helping, it's a wind energy project. They filed their social impact evaluation in July of 2016, and it was notified, the resolution was notified yesterday. So almost 2 years of delay. In the first year and a half, my client was not even interested in pushing the process because they were thinking about other issues, interconnection and all the issues that need to be handled. But then a due diligence process started in order to, who's going to buy this project? And they asked about the EVIs, and we asked about the EVIs at CENER, and they said, back in February, maybe by mid-May. Okay, thank you. Well, at the end, it has come by early June. But it's not okay, because the presidential rules, the reglamentos, say that the CENER has 90 business days in the case of hydrocarbons and 90 calendar days in the case of electricity to issue the resolution. So CENER was pretty late in this case, and it's only an example, but there are many cases that have been suffering this delay. And certainly, the main problem is lack of resources, human resources and material resources. You go to the offices of CENER, and now they are not in the main building, but in another building. They don't look like a federal agency. And we need, I guess, political commitment from the next administration to give and allocate more resources there. I hope they have it for the benefit of the industry. And basically, that's what I wanted to share, and I don't want to make you waste your time, and we can maybe open the discussion.
Thank you very much. You are not wasting our time. Thank you. So before I move on to the questions, I wanted to give a little bit of the perspective. As Lourdes said, this is an issue everywhere, right? And in particular, looking at some Latin American cases, this has been sometimes in some places the main obstacle actually for the development of the sector there. As we know, there are plenty of other above ground risks, regulatory, political instability and others, but sometimes these local issues turn out to be particularly problematic. I've been following, for example, the case of Colombia recently, and one thing that it's interesting is that these types of sector, particularly hydrocarbons, but a little bit also electricity, have some features that sort of make this conflict likely, right? One is you have in oil, at least, you have very significant rents. So, the project could generate, a lot of extraordinary profits. And if local actors realize that, they might want to have a share of those rents, because they can block the project, the generation of those rents. And if you realize that you have that power, that opens up a big opportunity. Similarly, because of the nature of some of these projects that are large sunk costs, like pipelines or like infrastructure facilities, etc. You also sort of can, even if they don't generate big rents, you can affect them significantly, because the investor is already there. He cannot have doesn't have an alternative to move elsewhere. On top of that, you don't decide. I mean, in other businesses, you decide where you locate, right? You can put a manufacturing plant. You can search for all over Mexico to decide where you locate it. Here, you have to be where the resource is, right? So, as a result, it might be a place in which social conflicts are very prominent. It might be a place that is very poor, in which there is crime, as Tony mentioned, and I agree with Jose Maria that there are positive and negative effects to the community, without a doubt. But so you are intervening sometimes in an area that nothing similar to this has ever happened, and it's a big deal. It's not like like putting a manufacturing plant in Monterrey. That happens every day, right? So this is a big intervention in a particular community. So how do you balance, the things that have to do with legitimate concerns about the environment, about the negative externalities in terms of roads becoming clogged, the migration of people to a certain area during the construction phase, and all these issues that are very legitimate concerns about the community and that are clearly to be compensated. How do you sort of manage that versus sort of the potential for this becoming a way to extort money from the companies? The other issue that I think is pretty relevant for Mexico is you see a very significant differences between countries in terms of how they manage the revenues generated by the activity. So, for example, in some federal countries, like the U.S. or Canada, Alberta retains most of the revenues generated for the state from the activity, whereas in Mexico, as in other countries, it's extremely centralized. Historically has been centralized. Of course, it goes back to the communities, but at least in terms of where the oil is being produced doesn't get us, the largest share of the revenues, like in Canada, for example. So that generates issues of alignment in terms of local politicians' interests, governors, and the like. So in Colombia, for example, recently, they realized, they made an evaluation and realized that the royalties that were going, were mostly going to the producing areas, were being totally wasted. There was massive corruption. Majors were building, bullfighting rings and things that didn't make any sense and over cost, etc. So the government decided to centralize it back into the hands of the national government, and only give them the money if they presented a viable project and they will execute it properly. Of course, most of the communities were not able to present a proper project, and so the backlog now is immense. But the key element is that now local communities, majors, governors, now they go to the private operator of the oil field and say, hey, I'm not getting any money anymore, so I want some money. And the company says, no, I'm paying the same taxes that I was paying before. So call the government, and they say, well, I don't care. I'm just seeing you here. I don't see the government. I see you here, and I can block your activity. So please pay a little bit more attention to me. Otherwise, you will face the consequences. So that's generating much more conflicts than before. And so my question after all this introduction is, how do you sort of manage these issues of, and I might be, wrong, Lourdes, about how much money goes into the communities versus not. By the way, there is an issue of equity and fairness. Why don't you want to concentrate the revenues in a particular community? If I was the operator there, I would love that the money is concentrated in the community because I want them to be happy. But from the perspective of the Mexicans, in all the country, they would prefer a more equitable, distribution and not concentrated in operating areas. But so how do you manage these issues that some have to do with legitimate social and environmental conflicts, some have to do with just fighting for the rents? And, starting with Lourdes, but, I would like to hear from all of you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and perhaps in answering I may touch upon a couple of other things that were mentioned. I think it's important to address. Well, in the case of Mexico, it is important to also note that the reform brought a fundamental change in the way we manage the oil rent. And this is something that also is not very much talked about, but anybody who is interested can basically go to the webpage of the Fondo Mexicano del Petróleo, and they can get all the information. Because what happened is, before the reform, all the oil revenue would go to the Department of Finance, to the Ministry of Finance of Mexico, Hacienda. And they would distribute the money in different ways. They would use it basically to fund the budget, and then they would give some money to the different states. And when oil prices were $100 and our production was much higher than now, we have no idea of where all the money went from. It's very hard to see the infrastructure projects that should have been developed. They're not there, and there is big question about what happened there. So what the Fondo Mexicano del Petróleo, what the Constitution established is that the Fondo Mexicano del Petróleo receives all the oil revenues, both from the asignaciones, which are the entitlements that Pemex received, as well as from the oil contracts. All the payments, with the exception of the specific taxes, the ISR, go to the Mexican Petroleum Fund. And you can look at, in the webpage, you can go and see asignación by asignación or contract by contract and know exactly how much they are paying on a monthly basis. In addition to that, at the constitutional level, it was established how this revenue was going to be distributed. And there is a ceiling of 4.7% of GDP equivalent that goes to funding the next year's budget. So this is an important thing because we've heard in the presidential campaign one candidate specifically making all these crazy proposals, and it would seem that he thinks maybe money is going to come from, I don't know where, maybe oil revenues. Well, this is not the case because there is a constitutional ceiling to how much money you can get, because as I mentioned, there is this concept of sustainability that is driving the reform, and therefore we're thinking about future generations. So any additional money that comes in goes into a long-term investment fund, which cannot be touched under, almost any circumstances. It has to be really a major catastrophic crisis to be able to tap into that fund. And in addition to that, and then there are other funds specifically for scholarships or for infrastructure or for renewable energies, etc. But in addition to that, there is the distribution of the money, and there are specific taxes and specific revenues that go to the states. So actually, if I'm the state of Tabasco, for instance, I will be interested not only having fields being contracts being put out in my land, but also at sea, because the Gulf of Mexico was divided up into areas, and so depending on which area you are, it corresponds to a given state, and that state is going to get the revenue. And in addition to that, finally, what I had already mentioned, it is written into the law that when you have an oil contract, you have to negotiate a percentage that goes to the community. And of course, everybody, as you can assume, is going to go for the highest number, the top, which, when you talk about oil projects, is a lot of money. And that is in addition to whatever you do in terms of social responsibility or whatnot. So the issue is not that there will not be money. I think there's going to be a lot of money flowing to these regions as the reform gets implemented. The big question is, we need transparency to know that this money is actually going where it has to go. And this is why what I mentioned about EITI is really important. We were working with EITI and with Energy, which is another an NGO, to make sure that we can get schemes and channels to not only make transparent how the money goes down to the state and to the municipality and to the communities, but also to make sure that there is a way to decide on which projects are going to be funded, so that the money doesn't end up, going into conspicuous consumption or whatever, but into things that the community really wants to see being built. And as part of this, actually, one of the issues that has been also central is having women being part of the decision-making process. Because it is the case that in most communities, when the women are involved, the money goes to things that are good for the community, and when it's just the men deciding what to do with the money, it either goes into the baseball or the football field or into the beers and women. So well, it's a sad reality, but it's a fact. And I will leave it at this because I've already talked too much.
I just want to add something about principles and then institutions and then what happens on the ground in this. It's not an easy problem to solve. This is an important conversation. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think it has to do with, interests and then values, and I'll say something about interests first, because I think we have to make sure that everybody that has an interest in that development, whether it's just the community in terms of their benefit, and they have to see a very real benefit. If you have a windmill that goes up in Oaxaca, for example, in the community, and they were promised X number of benefits, but Mexico, and we know how corrupt Mexico can be. It's not by nature, it's not culture, it's lack of institutions, it's a number of issues. I'm not saying that this is cultural, but it can be very corrupt. So if the community was promised X number of benefits, and then the months go by, the windmills go up, and the people still don't have any water, they still have to walk 2 hours 2 hours to get water. Their children are still studying in the same shack. They're still doing. If they don't see any change, they're going to say, okay, this is not good for us, and they're going to sabotage the project. That's the reality at the bottom. And it's very difficult to trust the Mexican government, federal, state, or local. I mean, look at what happened with Vicente Fox when he was the president. There was a huge rainfall. The oil was very expensive, and there was a huge budget rainfall from oil income. And then the governors were given a lot of money, and then the governors just stole the money. That's what they did. And so how do you ensure that the institutions are going to get that product and that the people at the bottom are really going to see a benefit? That's going to be very, very hard. Or even if, as Lourdes said, a project comes through up to the institute, and then the money comes down, and then they say, oh, it was for a new road for the farmers to be able to get their crops out to the main road and so on. And then all of a sudden some politician stole 20 or 30% of the money and the road is not complete. The farmers didn't see the benefit, even if the road was 50%, 60% done. It's a road with a gap in the middle is no good. So the farmers aren't going to see the benefit, and they're going to undermine the project. So the institutions have to be very clear. The implementation, the groups, the communities, the watchdogs have to be all put in place to make sure that these things, that everybody gets their share. And that's very difficult to do in a country where corruption is very high. And this is why I spoke about corruption in the beginning. Corruption is going to be really a huge block to make sure that these communities get what they were promised, what they think they deserve, and so on. And the other thing is about priorities and then values. Priorities. Look at the Mexicali conflict that I just mentioned. Mexicali is a very dry place. It's the desert out there. There's very little water. So, or Tamaulipas, where there's very little water. Should the water go to shale projects, or should the water go to the communities and the agricultural communities? You have to decide the priorities. And sometimes deciding the priorities is a matter of a dialogue and so on. And sometimes people will decide that the water is for agriculture or for industry or for the city and the residents, and it's not for shale. That's a priority. And the gas and the oil may have to stay in the ground because that's a priority, and that's a political choice. It's not a matter of coming in and saying, hey, energy projects have a priority, and I think the law goes along those lines, that energy projects have a priority over the other uses of land and water and so on. This is a priority in national development. No, sometimes the community decides a different way, and that's a legitimate way of doing it. I, too, am a political scientist, and I can tell you that sometimes that's the priority. And then values. Look, I may have a huge, I say this mostly because I spent 5 years in the seminary, right? So somebody over here, some sponsor of mine at some point, had this huge crucifix. It was gold, and it was hanging on the wall. And I said, oh, that's really interesting gold crucifix here on the wall. What a waste of gold, you know? This gold could be invested, could be somewhere else. Well, that's his value. To have the gold hanging on the wall in just, sheer gold. Okay, that's a value. And I cannot deny that his spiritual welfare is just as important as his material welfare. Why is the spiritual welfare, why is the community that believes that this is sacred ground in Dakota not have the same respect for their values, their sacred land, their cemetery, and the pipeline has to have the priority to go right through their cemetery? You have to have institutions that balance all these different things, the interests, the priorities, and the values too. And I think we tend to discount the value of the last two. And we tend to say it's all about interests. Sometimes, yes, and very often you can buy people off. But then if it is going to be about that, then you have to find the institutions to ensure that the money goes down. Because I know Mexico very well. And I know that things always go wrong down at the very implementation of the road will not be finished. The school will not be painted and fixed. And nobody will know what happened to the money.
You wanted to make a comment? By the way, that's not in Mexico. That happens in 80% of the countries that I work with. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would like to thank you for allowing me to make a comment, because I could agree with you almost fully. I mean, but I think also I would really invite you to look at least what we tried to do in the law and we've been trying to implement. And there's certainly, as I mentioned in my intervention, there is a lot of work to do. But first of all, and I agree with you, I am against shale, and that's part of the reason why I left the Department of Energy in Mexico, because I think, you know, we should not be doing this type of projects when we have conflicting interests. But the thing is, the law is very clear. Water cannot be used for any kind of project, and including shale, if it's going to put at risk drinking water. And that's the law, and that's the way it is. And that's why there is a consultation to communities, because, you know, if you try to impose the project is not going to be developed. The one thing, and this is why I insisted, and this is something that I have to be very clear about it, you know, I am surprised, but it's my experience. NGOs have blocked it. It's the matter of transparency. We should have full transparency about where the money goes. Communities do get a lot of money, and the money, it's not that it ends up necessarily in the hands of the politicians or the state. It gets also in the hands of some people who, you know, dress themselves as social activists and who have their own vested interest. I had people come back, you know, bang at my, how do you say, bang at my table and ask me to give them candidacies to become representatives in Congress. I mean, I was the deputy secretary for hydrocarbons, you know, not in a political party, and they wanted to be representatives for PRD and for PRI and for this and for that. And there are a lot of people at the local level also who have a lot of interest, vested interest, and who do not want things to change. The other thing is, and this is something that I learned from going and talking to the people and looking at the numbers and all of that, is that there are times where people did get the payments, but part of what the errors that Pemex and CFE did is that they would pay people like once in a lifetime. So maybe 20 years ago they made a huge payment, but people don't remember or don't recall, or only one person got all the money and ran away with it, okay? So this is why having the transparency and having a, you know, some kind of a fund, a fideicomiso, to have all the money and have the community know where the money is going and how it is being invested is so important. But there is a lot of resistance to this type of things. And so I think, and I agree with you with the issue of values. Why should I impose my value and my worldview on other people? They have the right to protect what their view is. The thing is, and in the case of Oaxaca, I saw it very clearly in where the wind farms are, they want to solve problems that have, you know, 10 years history or even longer through one project, through blocking one project. And that's not the way to deal with it. And finally, in terms of value, part of the problem that we're having is everything is not just money. An area like the Istmos of Tehuantepec has gotten, for their perspective, well, you know, for their what they used to get, a lot of money. And part of the problem that they have is that you have households where the wives have run away with the investors, you know, with the foreign. They complain about this. They said, we don't like the Spaniards because they come and they take away our wives. The children don't want to study because the parents are getting 20,000 pesos a month for renting their parcel, and so they don't want to do farming, they don't want to study, they don't want to do anything because they have sold their life, you know, their income. And then they complain about, you know, there are no opportunities, our kids are getting drunk, they're not working, they're spending, the women complain that their husbands are spending their money in prostitutes. I mean, this is a much more complex issue where you really have to construct a way where bringing these projects to an area create positive development and not just distortions where nobody's really benefiting. And additionally, there is something that I am really opposed, which is that to have this idea that the projects and the investors are going to solve what are responsibilities of the state. The state is responsible for building the roads. The state is responsible for building the hospitals, the schools, etc. It is not the responsibility of the developer. And I think that's one thing where we have to call on the government to comply with their own obligations. Because otherwise, we get all the responsibilities confused, and then you don't get any kind of result. So I think that's important. And just one final comment. Tony did mention the issue that Tamaulipas didn't have projects. Tamaulipas actually has a lot of projects, not only exploration and production, but also electricity. And actually, what is really interesting in the case of Tamaulipas is when I was Undersecretary of Electricity, I was telling all the developers, don't go to Tamaulipas. That's SETA land and, SETA country, and it's going to be very difficult. Well, let me say it with all the sadness that it creates, that it brings to me. They have been extremely successful. Yeah. They have been very successful in negotiating with organized crime. And all those projects are, they have zero problem. And I asked them, I said, well,
that's why the map doesn't show any conflicts there.
How do you get,
right.
How do you get the agreements? And basically they said, well, we talk to them, and basically what they say is you can work from 5 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. After 5 in the afternoon, get ready to get shot. And so people work from 5 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, and they have, have had no problem building wind farm parks, doing EMP work, building pipelines. I mean, they have no problems. And truly, I think it's really sad. I think it's something that's really wrong when it's easier to negotiate with organized crime than it is to work with to negotiate with communities.
Wow. Jose Maria.
I just wanted to add that you were asking about the balance and how to achieve the balance between protecting the public interest and the private interest of energy developers. It's not easy. It's a matter of that needs work every day. From the side of the energy companies, what I would say is the approach to Mexico needs to be with, I would say, humility and with a great willingness to know the country well, to know what is going on in each community, to know what are the problems, to study them correctly, and to assess the issues adequately. For that purpose, well, there are first-level anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, economists in Mexico that are doing already these social impact evaluations. Now they have more work, which is good for those professionals, but they are doing normally a good work, and it's useful for the company to see that evaluation and to see what are they going to face in the land. At the end of the day, projects are possible and are being built, and we have pipelines, we have wind farms, we have oil fields producing. The country is having its energy development as it has been envisioned by the energy reform, despite its problems. But certainly the specific cases of conflict that have blocked certain projects, I think Miriam is going to be talking about specific cases, but and I would like to know from you, what do you see in common from them? Do you see something in common from the attitude of the companies, or what is going on in the land? Anyway.
Can I say one more quick thing about that? I think we have to look ahead as well. And I suspect that in the next administration, I'm assuming López Obrador will be the president of the United Mexican States. What is he going to be like? I suspect that it's going to be, at least for a while, a very uncertain place, because we don't know if he's going to give priorities to development, to the communities, to the society, to the different groups, to how is he going to deal with organized crime. So we definitely are facing a slightly more uncertain environment in the coming at least a couple of years while they settle, because the messages that have come out of his campaign are very mixed. some of his advisors who are kind of a little way on the left say, oh no, we're gonna turn all that back, we're gonna turn the clock back, and I'm like, well, okay, good luck on doing that. But then some, like Rocío Nale herself, has been moderate. Well, we're going to look at corruption, but we're not going to move that. We're going to move this. We're not going to move that. But maybe some of that will go ahead and some not. And then they asked Mr. López Obrador, and he says, I don't agree with that. So he, in a very Trumpian way, he's contradicting his own team. And so we don't really know what they really stand for. So we are definitely heading into a slightly more uncertain environment. And when it comes to social conflicts, because of his philosophy, his more populist ideas, will he give greater priority to the complaints of the communities, to the campesinos, to the ejidos, to the indigenous communities, or will he then drive through and with some legitimacy of someone who comes from the left, Nixon visiting China and so on, will he say, no, this is going to move through? We don't know yet, but we're definitely up against a new era that's not as friendly, maybe, as the Peña administration was, to these investors.
I want to open up now to questions. I will take advantage of this intervention to plug I just wrote a piece on López Obrador and the energy reform that's going to happen that was published today in Forbes, so if you want to take a look at it. So questions, I will take first four questions. Please identify yourself, make it short, and don't forget to end it with a question mark.
Trabajo como asesor de energía en el consulado de Turquía en Houston. I work as an energy advisor at the Turkish consulate here. First question to Senor Payan. He explained that the sea of change will mainly come from the Trump administration in terms of bilateral relations instead of Mexican new presidency. So is it a common view? Is it your personal view? Or is it shared by many experts? And the second interrelated brief question, the United States has been going through an energy renaissance. It's going to be this energy superpower in terms of oil exports and natural gas exports. So Mexico has this potential to further cooperate with the United States as a neighbor. So do you expect, like United States also is a free market, but presidential intervention, a federal intervention is on the way for saving nuclear and coal power plants in U.S. So do you expect a federal intervention for by the Mexican president to solve all these complexities in Mexican energy sector?
No.
You take more, yes.
Hi, my name is Yvonne. I work, I'm a program coordinator at Puentes Consortium in the Mexico Center, but I'm also an independent consultant, and we've been following this issue for a while. And I've spoken to consulting firms in Mexico, and some of them say there's a big issue of insecurity. So it's not, so let's say in Tamaulipas, they managed to work with all these people, with the crime, but then there's also the issue of not being able to work in the field with the indigenous people, with the interest groups, because they just don't want to mess with this. It's so dangerous. So they're just limiting themselves to do recommendations from their desk, which is so dangerous as well, because then they're not really tackling the real problem. So I agree, there's a lack of resources, a lack of people to manage this thing, but is the government envisioning some kind of step forward on this, or is this going to be outsourced? Because that's the question for us, because really I've heard the chambers of commerce from the UK and Germany are organizing these NGOs and the consulting firms to come up with recommendations and to come up with protocols to do this. And why is not the government or the states acting on this? Probably it's not a question for you directly, but you had an experience firsthand, or maybe in the next panel it could be exposed somehow. But this is a key question for all of us interested in this topic.
Over there. Yes.
My name is Roseanne Franco. I'm head of oil and gas risk at First Maplecroft. Yes. So my question is one of the common themes that you all talked about is corruption that's kind of been replicated in your different presentations, but also the need for more transparency. And given that AMLO, his key agenda has been anti-corruption, I was wondering if you could speak more to his track record, at least as mayor, his campaign, what he's put forward, his platform. How would you tackle that? I mean, what do you see tangibly, and what would that mean to actually achieve this, go in this direction? Which clearly this would be a huge success for Mexico if he were to be successful in this regard.
Thank you. There, and we.
Hi, my name's Matthew Atkins, work for Chevron. Just a brief question. Have you ever seen an instance where the energy operator works directly with the community and actually takes on the obligation of building out some of these social projects to ensure that the community is actually receiving the benefits that they've been promised, rather than relying on payments from the local and the federal government?
No crime.
No.
My name is Charles Lafkoff. I'm an independent analyst. The 2 points I got from the panel here is that there's a need for financial transparency and that there's also a corruption problem. To me, those are mutually exclusive. And so what's the Mexican solution to that problem, short of, say, people going to jail when they should or not?
Okay, who want to start?
I'll say something about Lopez Obrador because I've been watching him very closely, and then I'll leave the rest of the questions to my colleagues and friends here. We're all now trying to read the tea leaves and the crystal ball and all the words that in omancia, so figure out what's going to happen. It is very difficult right now to know where he's going. I know it's a shift, and it's a shift from the right to left. How left? I'm not convinced that he is radically crazy left. Not anymore. There's a couple of things that tell us that he's going to be somewhat more reasonable than we think, or at least that we were panicking. Because if you look at his record as mayor of Mexico City, he was actually quite pragmatic. He did build clientelistic networks. In that sense, he's a very Mexican politician. He created a whole base. I mean, Mexico City is definitely going to go Morena this time. His political party, they're probably going to sweep the city and so on. So he clearly knows how to weave his networks and his clientelistic networks. So he's in that sense an old politician. That actually solves problems, believe it or not, in the Mexican context. Why? Because that means that he's going to call upon the powers of the state, which the previous administrations have not been able to, governors, mayors, civil society, and so on, to sit at the table and then weave themselves into a clientelistic network and sort of bring that back together again, sort of weave it back together tightly and then pay everybody off at some level. So if he behaves in the same way that he behaved in Mexico City, I think a lot of these social conflicts are going to be solved by the fact that he's going to call upon the good old proven methods of Mexican politics of the 20th century. That's a suspicion, but looking at that, number one. Number two, I think in Mexico City, he worked very closely with the quintessential member of the mafia in power in Mexico, Carlos Slim. And they completely rebuilt the downtown Mexico City. His meeting this week with the business council is a good sign that they're beginning to accept the reality of a potential presidency by him. They're beginning to take it in, to digest it, and then building bridges to him. And I think it also means that he's willing to sit down at the table and talk to them. So in that sense, I think he's going to listen to them. He may or may not do it. I mean, sometimes, it's uncertain, but I think at least there is the willingness that they can, or the sign that they can sit down at the table and negotiate, and maybe they can say, hey, we can help you do this and this and this and accomplish that and that if you help us on this. And I think that's a certain degree of pragmatism. I've said it before in a presentation that we had here, that he was playing the nationalistic card, the populist card, and the pragmatic card. His strategy, his campaign was put together with these three cards that he held very closely. In some places he sounded like a real radical populist. His base sounds like it. In some places, he was considerably more pragmatic in his message, and in other places, like Ciudad Juarez, when his campaign started, he was very nationalistic. We're not going to be Mr. Trump's piñata. And so he kind of reivindicated the dignity of Mexico. So he played it very smartly this time. But part of those cards was pragmatism. So in that sense, I think he's going to be slightly more pragmatic. But we should expect a shift to putting Mexico first. That's for sure. I mean, why? Because we in the United States enabled that card. If Hillary Clinton were president of the United States and the status quo globally, geopolitically, commercially were still there in place, then he wouldn't have had that card. And it would have been it would have been harder for him to climb. But that made it very easy because Trump pulled the rug from under a lot of these different concepts that we were operating under. And so it enabled him quite a bit. And so in that sense, I think it's a more uncertainty, but I don't think he's going to be, I think we're looking at Mexico reloaded, 1970 reloaded, something like that, with clientelistic networks, negotiations, putting people at the table, giving everybody something. But we have to think he's not quintessentially anti-American. I don't remember him having attacked the United States. I don't remember him having been very critical of the United States at all. His nationalism is inward looking. It's about and number two, I don't think he's quintessentially anti-foreign investment either. He's not hostile to that. He's not Chavez. He's not, he's going to operate on a more nationalistic basis, for sure. But I don't think he's unwilling to cut a deal. And so we just go back to a less institutional, more personalistic way of building clients and clientelistic relationships. So we should expect some of that. I think
we are running out of time, but I want Jose Maria and Lourdes to finish. I just wanted to say that Hugo Chavez was much more pro foreign investment in the campaign than under Manuel López Obrador. That's true. Jose Maria.
Yeah, just to say that there were a couple of questions about corruption and transparency. López Obrador does not have an anti-corruption agenda properly. He talks a lot about the way things are going to change magically when he arrives at the presidency, and with his example of virtue, everyone in the public administration at all levels is going to behave well. That's absurd. That's not the way things work. Corruption is, we need stronger institutions, definitely. And so there's not really a policy that is being proposed by him to fight this endemic problem. There are proposals in the civil society that have to do with the autonomy of the Attorney General office and some other measures, but that have not been like I would say embraced by López Obrador yet. Let's see at the end what are his policies. Hopefully he has some, because certainly corruption.
Lourdes, you have the last word.
Yeah. First of all, the election has not taken place. It is July 1st, and we'll have to wait and see who wins the election, because I may just recall that Hillary Clinton was the winner November 6th, and as far as I can see, the president is Donald Trump. So I still have my expectations that maybe things will be different, and not because the election will be rigged. It's very difficult to rig an election in Mexico these days, but because people are going to go and vote. And the number of people who have not defined their vote or who do not want to say who they're going to vote for is very high. That being said, yes, Mexico does have a problem of corruption, but there was a whole system that was created, the National Anti-Corruption System, which unfortunately the Peña Nieto administration has not allowed to be fully implemented, but I think it should be fully implemented, and we should have transparency. Transparency is the key element to fight corruption. And the other thing that is important in terms of fighting corruption is that everybody has to take the responsibility for what they have to do. I already mentioned how the government has to take responsibility for doing what governments do, like building roads and hospitals and schools and whatnot. companies have to also undertake their own responsibility for what it is. The reason why we have a social impact study and a social evaluation is so that they can decide whether or not they want to take the risk to develop a project in a given area. If the conditions are not good, then they should not run the risk. They should go elsewhere. Mexico, in that way, we're very lucky because we have a lot of diversity. And if you cannot develop your wind park in Oaxaca, you can do it in Zacatecas. You can do it in Tamaulipas if you want to negotiate with the Zetas or whatever. I think, and going to your question, which is a difficult question, but I'm saying it fast because we have not enough time. But Mexico has, 32 states, and we cannot put everything in the same bag. It's not the same thing to go to Tamaulipas that it is to go to Campeche or Yucatan. And the fact is Mexico has one of the biggest flows of foreign investment, the direct investment going into the country right now. If everything was as black and as bleak as we have heard right now, nobody would be going there. Querétaro would not be having the growth rate that it has. Aguascalientes would not have all the Japanese investment with Japanese people living there as it has. Mérida would not be where it is. I mean, we have to be fair. Yes, we do have problems. And yes, we need more rule of law, we need to stop corruption, but we also need to be more fair and have a good diagnosis of what the problems are. Because if we don't have a good diagnosis, the solutions are going to be the wrong solutions for the problem. And I don't know the people that you talked about, but I do want to mention, I did deal with companies who wanted to solve social issues, sending women who came out of a Vogue magazine with high heels, short skirts, and low cleavages going to the communities to talk to indigenous populations. Well, that's not the way you solve issues. No. And then you have people also saying, oh, it's very difficult, oh, it's very violent, oh, it's this. No. You solve the issues going to the areas. And sometimes it means, like people who work for me at the ministry, taking a bus at midnight and going, all the night in a bus to get to Juchitán, Oaxaca, and talking to people in the morning and being in the assemblies and hearing and going to the field and, sitting with the Yaquis at, 100 degrees under the sun to listen to them and have negotiations. And a lot of people don't want to do that. A lot of people prefer to say, oh no, this is very hard, oh no, this is difficult, oh no, this is violent, instead of doing the work. So I would just leave it at that. I think we need to be much more, everybody has to be much more responsible and more honest about what the issues are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this terrific panel. So now we have a short 10-minute break, and then Melinda Taylor from the UT Center for Energy Law and Business will moderate our next panel. Thank you.